Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Jorge Smith. Tonight, Zambia thrashes out a reprieve from its creditors for its massive debt, and the World Bank offers to bring in a pause mechanism for its debtors at a summit in Paris aimed at reshaping outdated and cumbersome global financial architecture that's getting in the way of the world's response to the climate emergency. And also, Kenya's new proposed tax package is an unwelcome surprise for many as lawmakers approve unpopular tax hikes, including a doubling of fuel tax, higher sales taxes for businesses, and a new unpopular housing levy. President William Ruto, though, still has to sign the bill into law. But first, breakthroughs have already begun at a Global Finance Summit here in Paris aimed at easing the debt burden on some of the world's most vulnerable countries whilst freeing up billions of dollars in new funds for climate finance. There have been increasing calls for a total makeover of the world's financial architecture. That's how multilateral development banks and international financial institutions like the World Bank are set up and operate. Low-income countries are pushing for a complete overhaul. Zambia's already reached a deal with its creditors, including China, to restructure $6.3 billion in loans. Our Caroline Lambele tells us more.
Amid the flurry of pledges and promises at the summit on reshaping global finance, Ugandan climate activist Vanessa Nakate took to the stage in Paris just after French President Emmanuel Macron. She urged leaders to think about the human impact of the climate crisis.
I would like to begin by asking all of us to hold a moment of silence for people around the world, those who are already helpless, hopeless, and dying due to the devastating impacts of the climate crisis.
Around 40 world leaders are attending the summit, including about a dozen from Africa. They're focused on tackling poverty and climate change issues by reshaping the global financial system. Senegal has already struck a deal with wealthier countries for an initial $2.7 billion in finance to develop renewable energy and speed up its transition to a low-carbon economy. A similar agreement was sealed by South Africa in 2021, but in Paris, the country's president said it had fallen short.
And we found this to be a pioneering deal, quite historic, in that an amount of $8.5 billion was committed to support our transition to clean energy. Actually, we're going to need much more, up to $98 billion.
The head of the World Bank also announced it was planning to allow countries facing a crisis to suspend their debt repayments. Several other deals are expected before the summit's end on Friday.
So with me now is Jorge Moreira de Silva, the Executive Director of UNOPS. That's the UN's Office for Project Services, which works across Africa and elsewhere to boost sustainable development infrastructure. He also used to head up development cooperation for the OECD and was Portugal's Minister for Environment and Energy. So, George, thank you so much for coming in to speak to me. You know, you're in a really unique position to be able to have an overview of the importance of this summit. And you were at the first day of the talks today, and you were telling me that, you know, these things can be quite dry from the perspective of the ordinary viewer, but that you felt whilst being there that it was really quite energized, and that you were particularly impressed by, you know, some of what was being said by the young lady that we just heard from, Vanessa Nakate. So why do you think that it's so important for Africa, and that you felt so impressed by the energy of the conversations being had here in Paris?
Thank you, George. Indeed, I was impressed by the energy, because very often in this kind of summits, especially if the jargon is about Global Finance Pact, you can very quickly get trapped into the traditional jargon and technocracy language. That was not the case. I think that Vanessa Nakate was very impressive in bringing development to the core of today's conversation. So it was not about finance, it was about the role of finance in support of those most in need. I also think that the way that President Macron and also the Prime Minister Mia Mottley addressed the audience was putting all of us in the action mode, with the UN Secretary General also bringing his bold perspective of the reform of the system. Mia Mottley said that she calls this summit the "How Dare You" summit, because 80 years after the start of the Bretton Woods, it's the first time, it's really the first time where we are discussing not just the mobilization, how to go from billions to trillions, how to mobilize public and private finance, but also addressing what are we missing on the regulation, on governance, on standards. So I think that this summit is very important to fix some of the problems that we are facing. And let's make no mistake, 2015 was a great year. Paris Agreement, SDGs, Addis Ababa Action Agenda, or Financing for Development. Today, we are off track. Only 12% of the SDGs are on track.
The SDGs, the Sustainable
Development Goals. Regarding Paris, the climate action, we are in a trajectory towards 2.6 to 2.8 degrees, not 1.5. And on financing for development, with COVID, the financing gap for developing countries to implement the Sustainable Development Goals has widened from 2.5 to almost $4 trillion. So clearly, just addressing the speed meter to how much we spend doesn't work. We need to understand what do we need to expand the concessional finance, more ODA, more blended finance, more public and private mobilization. What we need to leverage more finance through the lending capacity from multilateral development banks. What we need to increase the access to liquidity and to the special drawing rights that are quite unbalanced vis-à-vis Africa, for instance, and what we need to reform the governance of the international finance system. So I think that the agenda is quite ambitious. Let's make no mistake. It's not the kind of agenda that can be addressed with some sort of complacency, but I think it's fundamental. Why? Because this year, 2023, it's the moment where we have to put ourselves on track. We have this summit today and tomorrow. We have the SDG summit in September. That is the summit where the Secretary General of the United Nations wants to rescue the SDGs and to accelerate the implementation of the SDGs. And then we have the COP28 in the United Arab Emirates to address to raise the ambition on the climate action. So
we keep on saying that these summits are really important, and we're talking about SDGs. We're using very kind of technical language, but as Vanessa called on the attendees to do, how do you put this into a human context, particularly an African human context? Why is this important? What does it mean in terms of the lived experience of people on the African continent?
Yeah, that's the fundamental question, Jorge, because in Africa, as you know from the discussion that you have in this program that I've been following for many years, the question is not just about greening energy. You have 600 million citizens in Africa without access to electricity, which is 53% of the Africans with no access to electricity. At the same time that we are saying that we need to decarbonize the world and to foster renewable energy and clean energy. And we need $1 trillion investment on clean energy for developing countries. And how much is Sub-Saharan Africa getting on investment on clean energy? 1.5% of the global investment. So you have 600 million people without access to electricity, and in Sub-Saharan Africa, only 1.5% of all investment in clean energy is going to that country. At the same time that we know that 60% of the best places for solar energy is in Africa, but only 1% of the installed capacity on photovoltaic, it's in Africa. So obviously there is a paradox that is, in one way, you have to compatibilize the access to energy because it's a sine qua non condition to eradicate poverty. At the same time, that you should create the conditions to avoid that Africa will be seated in stranded assets. So you need to foster renewable energy, but you can only do it with additional resources, with additional finance. I think it's important that now that we are very much focused on the consequences of the war in Ukraine, the impact of the inflation in Europe, I think it's important to know that the other crises have not stopped. So I think that it's important to provide additional resources to Ukraine, additional resources to Africa. And there is one element, it's where UNOPS, so it's the UN Agency for Operations, plays a role, that is on infrastructure. So you need to go beyond just providing finance. You need to create the best conditions for the best projects to be implemented, the bankable projects, technical assistance, capacity building. And I would say there are two figures very quickly that are relevant to illustrate how relevant it is, the infrastructure in this context. 92% of the Sustainable Development Goals, the targets, depend on infrastructure. So unless you get it right, no SDGs at all. Second, 80% of the current global greenhouse gas emissions are related with infrastructure. So unless you decarbonize the infrastructure, you will not succeed on the 1.5 degrees. So this summit is not just about finance, it's aligning finance with SDGs and with climate action. Thank you so much, Jorge, for talking us through that and for really laying out the importance of the conversations being had here in Paris. Jorge Moreira de Silva there, the Executive Director of UNOPS. Well, in other news, Kenya's parliament has voted through a raft of tax hikes in the first budget of President William Ruto. The contentious changes will double the tax on fuel to 16% to generate another 61 billion Kenyan shillings, or a little under 400,000 euros for the government. The bill still has to be signed by Ruto, and opposition members have threatened to call fresh protests if he does. The bill also proposes a new housing levy, which Ruto says will help build more affordable homes. But many Kenyans, already hit hard by the rising cost of living, say that they can't shoulder any extra cost. Our correspondent tells us more.
Nearly 200,000 people reside in Kibera, one of the many slums in Nairobi. In total, 36% of the capital's population lives in unsanitary conditions. The need for affordable quality housing is huge.
Most of the houses, you look at them, most of them are shanties. Some of them are improved, but they are very small houses. We have a program that started there, but it never absorbed everybody.
To deal with the shortage, the authorities have announced a 1.5% tax on salaries. The goal is to use the money to build 250,000 houses a year. Many middle-class people don't like it.
It's not easy because of the taxes. Everything has gone high. Like, you see, we used to buy sugar 2 kgs at 260. Right now we are buying it at 460. That means it has doubled. So life has been very, very difficult. Yes, we have to minimize on everything that you are using.
People who contribute to the new tax will have access to cheaper houses. But for this economist, there are already many vacant apartments in Kenya, so the problem lies elsewhere.
There's a very abstract view that Kenya has a deficit of 250,000 houses every year. The average income in Kenya is $2,400, slightly about 2,000 euros per year. So the amount of housing you can buy for that amount of money is the constraint. It is not that investors or private sector would not be able to construct housing that people would buy. We actually think that the biggest barrier is the demand side, not the supply itself.
At present, there are no estimates on how much these houses will sell for, and therefore, if those in need will actually be able to afford them. The new tax goes into effect immediately. But the opposition says it will go to the courts to stop it.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Till then, take care.